Previously in Hedge Knights, the loot obtained from the war party was brought into the keep for closer study. Most of the glade members went out to fetch one last salix tree and as much slate as they could manage. Much more of the boundary wall was constructed, and the bison were given soft beds to sleep upon. Episode 29, Collective. The plan the Adlets had for winter was to make as much progress as possible constructing the boundary wall, while Sapo and Lazarus worried that the wild critters of the glade would eat the ambrosia with all of the ripthorn starting to wither in the winter's bitter air. So they suggested that the entry courtyard be walled off from the rest of the curtain yard. The northernmost salix tree needed to be uprooted and relocated as the new wall encroached upon its roots. Sapo said he'd handle it and make sure it was replanted well before it disintegrated away. Judea recommended that they reassess their boundary wall. With the toxic waste being hauled out to the trees, it would be important to have gatehouses and bridges to grant easier access to the trees. Traversing the deep marshes was slow and painstaking. Every additional minute spent in the marsh came at a cost of worsened health, so quick access to the trees to haul waste would be paramount. The altered plan for the boundary wall did come at a cost. A far more substantive system of bridges would be needed to cover sections of the marsh. Sapo and Lazarus would need to cut down nearly all the great pine in the glade, and it was possible they'd even need to head out to other glades where healthy pine trees thrive to source additional lumber. Tangier also suggested that the gates be strategically placed so that raiders who lacked breaching weapons would need to traverse long distances in order to attack the keep, offering the Adlets ample advanced warning before needing to take up arms. Sapo also made sure that everyone who was working out in the marshes were periodically checked for symptoms of sickness. They'd be exposed to the pollution for prolonged periods while hauling timber and bricks, and also constructing the walls and walkways. Aside from the search party nearly succumbing to the effects of pollution, the Adlets took great care to avoid the worst permanent side effects from overexposure. Back on the coast, the squires knew of many who ignored the illness and became confused or even abnormally forgetful. One major risk was losing consciousness from exposure and then collapsing into the pollution. If the victim isn't found quickly, the consequences are dire and usually fatal. Klein asked if the youngest calf could be named Gold Dragoon, after a rather famous squadron of Hedge Knights who served as mercenaries during the Dark Wars. Megahoof was vaguely familiar with the legend. He chuckled to himself that in a way the squires of the keep were now more like Hedge Knights, as they no longer served a king and fought their enemies without orders from a crown. Megahoof asked if Klein would like to spend a night storytelling over the fire and recount the tales of the Gold Dragoons. He thought that the children would like to hear the tales, but also requested that the more gory details be omitted. Klein loved the idea and asked if Megahoof had any spare parchment or vellum, as he could try to draw some pictures to go with the story. Sapo dug up the salix tree and wrapped its roots in soil and burlap in hopes the tree could be tricked into thinking it wasn't fully dug up. Many of the expansive system of roots had to be cut, but at least some of the roots remained to form a sort of root ball. Sapo wasn't sure this method would help the tree endure quite like Megahoof's hybrid extract treatment, and wasn't willing to leave the tree to decay if his own experiment proved fruitless. So he quickly tethered the tree to a few bison and dragged it north for replanting. Klein asked Megahoof if any of his books were storybooks or books of mythology. Klein had enjoyed reading the mythology books that Pennacook had in its library, and hoped Megahoof had something similar in storage somewhere. Megahoof shook his head and explained that he did indeed have many books he brought from the archives of Eleanora Island, but almost all of them were schematics, recipes, botany, or other science and research journals. Eleanor Island lacked the means to even write things down easily, as it had no plants to make parchment out of and almost no land creatures other than a herd of bison, so no vellum either. Only a few bison remained on the island when the Adlets resettled to evade the visitors. The few bison that were left were not hunted but instead used for industry. Almost nothing was written down in the coastal community, and when something needed to be recorded, it had to be etched in stone, which was far too labor-intensive to write down children's stories or oral history. Megahoof lamented to Klein about the lack of reading material. His mother had instilled a thirst for knowledge, which drove Megahoof to read some of the rather unexciting books that Eleanora had to offer, which is what Megahoof accredits his literacy. Unlike many of the other Adlets back on the coast, the squires were all literate and shared Megahoof's desire for adventure, knowledge, and new experiences. Megahoof explained that in the spring the group hoped to explore old castle ruins and would make an effort to recover as many books as possible. Maybe some would be fun and whimsical tales, and not just old tax ledgers or quartermaster requisition forms. The additional walls around the gate courtyard would allow for the keep's farmland to sprawl outwards as more soil was purified. Sapo and Lazarus hoped that by springtime they could have an entire plot dedicated to Devilstrand, as it hadn't grown fast enough in the blighted soil before winter claimed its budding caps. Heelroot also took a long time to grow. The Adlets had an increased need for its medicinal properties, as it was the stabilizing agent for the hybrid extract, so another field or two for Heelroot would be nice to have as well. There was a wild waste rat walled into the newly enclosed curtain farm. The Adlets would need to coax it out before it engorged on their ambrosia bushes. While the Adlets had a strange love for the twisted glade creatures, they were only willing to part with fungus in the offering pile, not precious ambrosia. Given the potentially addictive properties of ambrosia, it wasn't even a healthy thing for a waste rat to eat anyways. Both Judea and Dave felt healthy enough to return to construction work. Megahoof asked Klein if, through his work as a weaver, he knew of any way to weave clothing that would offer added protection from pollution, as the linen face masks the Adlets wore could only do so much. Klein perked up and replied that he did know of clothing that could protect a wearer from toxins far more effectively than the masks, but he had only weaved the clothing out of a puffy white fibrous flower that he hadn't seen growing in the Katrawa forest. Megahoof explained that he had brought a variety of ancient seeds with him to the keep, and asked if Klein could identify the seed of the white flower. Of course, Klein said. In fact, he had a lot of experience dealing with the seeds, because in order to obtain the fiber from the flower, you had to carefully pick the seeds out by hand, a very time-consuming process. Megahoof showed Klein some of his stored seeds, and Klein immediately pointed to one and said he was absolutely sure. "Do you know how to grow it?" "Absolutely not," he replied. Megahoof said not to worry. He likely had a book on it, and once he figured it out, he could have Lazarus and Sapo plant it in the spring. Megahoof went to his shelf of botany books to carefully thumb through the pages while skimming for any words that Klein used to describe the flower. Klein didn't know of the name of the flower, and the seed wasn't labeled either. Skimming his books for descriptions of a flower or seed was more time-consuming than he had originally anticipated. He brought some of the books to his bedside and decided that he'd skim them as reading material before bed. Hopefully he'd uncover clues before planting season. The temperature in the grove plummeted to frigidly cold temperatures. The stone walls of the keep absorbed all of the radiant heat from several hearths and was slightly warm to the touch, even in the sub-zero temperatures outside. The constructors had rigged the chimney for the steam geyser to also channel the heat of the geyser into the hearthstones. Between the coal-burning hearths and geyser-heated hearthstone, the keep remained sufficiently warm. Lazarus offered to make woolen parkas to shield from the cold, but nobody took up on his offer. The adlets couldn't stay in the pollution for very long without getting sick, so being cold when outside in the winter was a good reminder to seek shelter from both cold and pollution. Tangier mined channels into the slate hillsides that overlap the boundary wall. She hoped the channels would prevent attackers from using the rocky hills as a way to bypass the boundary wall. It would be an incredible undertaking to fully quarry the mountain, so a simple, narrow, excavated mountain pass would have to do. The northern section of the boundary wall was nearly completed. Most of it was made out of timber pylons driven deep into the marshy soil to build piers for timber walls. The constructors worried about wildfires and flash storms, despite the fact that there was very little in the way of combustible plants in the marsh. It was still possible the wall itself could be struck. Losing a large section of wall to lightning strikes and fire would be unfortunate, but they knew of no alternative. While preparing for bed, Megahu found details about a plant that fit the description Klein had offered. The book called it gossipium, and described it as being well suited for tightly knit clothing. While the book didn't have any details about growing it, at least Megahu now had a name for the plant and could far more easily cross-reference from other journals. The bison ran out of fungus once again, and they would need to dip into their hay supply to make sure they had enough to eat. Madsy managed to coax the wild waste rat out of the ambrosia fields, using some of Sappho's finest cooking. She lured it past the granite walls and out towards the eastern gatehouse, hoping to release it near the stockpile of food the Adlets kept for wild critters. The work for the boundary wall was arduous. The constructors' hands ached, and some of their calluses seemed infected from the toxic blight. Linen or wool gloves weren't tough enough to endure the labor of construction, and they didn't have the leather for tougher work gloves. The wooden handles of their tools needed to be replaced often. The toxin had a way of seeping into the semi-porous wood, weakening it and causing it to splinter and warp. The blight had a way of making everything twisted and warped. The pine trees, the ripthorn plants, even the waste rats themselves. Some Adlets even shared a theory that the pollution made the Adlets twisted and warped into visitors, but these theories were found to be baseless time and time again. Adlet doctors had done autopsies of killed visitors and found that despite their outward appearance being vaguely Adlet, their insides were entirely dissimilar. The visitors had chitinous horns protruding from a bony faceplate hidden under a thin layer of fur, and their eyes were red with vertical slits like that of a frog or lizard. Their jaws were more like a snake, only having loosely connected bones and elastic skin. It was theorized the loose skin allows them to swallow large pieces of food without chewing, and given their resistance to pollution and toxins, likely had extremely acidic liquids within their gut to help digestion as well. Their strange jaw structure might also be the reason for their near complete silence. Visitors were never found to speak at all. One thing was for certain, the visitors were very well adapted to the pollution. The working theory was that they caused the pollution as a way to empower themselves and also to snuff out all the life on the planet. The question nobody could answer or even fathom was why they would arrive only to kill everything in sight, like some sort of silent, monstrous herald of Armageddon. The alarm bell rung out from the keep, the signal of feral creatures. Arelco scrambled to grab his tools and race back to the keep, heeding the warning. The Adlets peered out of the arrow loops and wondered what these creatures even were. They were striped and of very strange colors, like if a waste rat crossed with a wolf, but somehow even more hideous. They yipped and scratched at the doors and walls, and the archers didn't think it was safe to have them skulk about. So many of the Adlets were sick from their time spent outside that only a few bowmen felt well enough to defend against the swarm. The animals stalked around the perimeter, dead set on finding a way into the keep. Arrow after arrow, they were not deterred. They had a crazed look in their eye, much like all the other feral creatures that had attacked previously. Megahoof asked the refugees if any of them had any idea what they were, but nobody rightly knew. Arelco's only response was that he hoped they tasted good. Megahoof thought privately to himself it was possible they wouldn't be edible or even be poisonous, but if Arelco wanted to eat them, he'd not stop him. Megahoof knew the Adlets needed more provisions for travel, and if Arelco wanted to taste test the meat of the strange critter before he dried the meat on the racks for travel, he could know for sure whether or not the meat was safe to eat. Something you don't want to find out many days' travel away from home. Megahoof and Arelco finished hunting the animals near the main gate and then set off to patrol the perimeter until either the animals left or they no longer posed a threat to the others. Arauco grew impatient, waiting for the feral animals to wander in view of the arrow loops, so he wedged the slab gate open and shouted at them to bait them towards the Merlin. Megahoof was surprised by Arauco's daring attempt to quell the threat of the beasts, and readied his bow to take advantage of the ploy. Arauco's method of luring the animals had worked, and 2 more of them were put down, but still more yelping could be heard near the east gate, so Megahoof turned to Arauco and asked if he was up to do it again. Without hesitation, Arauco wedged the slab gate open, but this time with help from Megahoof. Arauco posited whether or not they'd be tasty. The animals didn't look particularly pollution-struck, and he hoped the meat could be salvaged. Megahoof asked Arauco if his desire for eating meat is what drove him to his decision to depart from the keep. His answer was a terse no. After the last of the beasts were killed, Arauco told Megahoof to let him know when Sapo was finished butchering them for meat. Megahoof could tell Arauco's attitude towards the rest of the Glade members had significantly changed after his decision to depart, yet the others still didn't know. At some point, Megahoof would have to ask what sort of provisions Arauco needed before departing, because many of their traveling meals would be used to head to the ruins Madzi had mentioned. But clearly now was not the time for such a question. Madzi's voice echoed off the curtain walls, yelling, "Hey, you missed one!" The 2 adlets ran through the keep to find Madzi about to descend into the mines. As they approached, they could hear the yelping just south of the wall. Megahoof rushed to close the granite gate, allowing the 2 to safely fire upon the last animal. As soon as the 2 finished, Arauco went to fetch himself some mead to dull his nerves. Megahoof gave the all-clear that the glade was now safe, but just as he finished, Sapo interjected that while sheltering in the keep, he noticed many of the adlets had symptoms of sickness, and they may need to shelter even longer. Megahoof announced that he had good news on that front. Klein had made clothing to help protect against pollution even better than their masks, but it required a different kind of fabric, and they just so happened to have seeds for it. All that was left was for Megahoof to figure out how to grow it. Lazarus scoffed, "Just stick the seeds in the tilled soil and water it, more or less like everything else." Megahoof laughed and said that if he couldn't figure out how much water or sun the seeds needed, he'd hand most of the seeds over to Lazarus and Sapo for them to sow anyway. Megahoof pulled Sapo aside and quietly asked him to cook up a meal from the butchered meat for Arauco, as Arauco had requested it, and to wait to see if the meat didn't sicken him before starting to dry it on the racks for traveling provisions. Sapo raised his eyebrows and replied, "Are you sure?" Megahoof nodded and said that Arauco mentioned wanting to eat the beasts multiple times while they hunted, so although Megahoof wasn't sure about feeding potentially dangerous meat to Arauco, Arauco felt differently. Sapo made a meal for Arauco and set it aside, but decided to start drying the meat anyway so it wouldn't spoil. If Arauco's health wasn't affected, then Sapo could mix the dried meat in with the rest of the provisions, but if he did fall ill, he'd dump the dry meat. The Adlets made significant progress constructing support piers and slate walls around the perimeter of the glade, Soon the frost would thaw, so they'd need to start purifying the soil around the keep for new plots of double strand, heelroot, and gossipium. Thank you for tuning in to episode 29 of Hedge Knights Collective. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to join my gaming community, Rhadamant.com or the description of this video have a link to Discord. It also has a link to Twitch if you want to tune in to any of my live streams. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow adlets,